Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of In Lay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Ascari, and my guest with me today is Mr. Chris Weisdorf. Hello, Chris, and welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me, Payman.
Chris, how's this Friday treating you? Yeah, you're excited for the weekend?
Yeah, no, I just it's busy with respect to doing video conferences. I haven't been this busy, I don't know, at least a year because back in 2021 I was doing this all the time. 2022 dropped off, but still I was still doing it. 2023 not so much, 2024 hardly anything, and now here we go where I'm just you know a lot going on on a Friday, which is a little unusual for me at this time of since we've been through all the tyranny in the past and dealing with all that. Yeah, so I welcome it, and in the weekend I'm going to a birthday party tomorrow, so it should be all right.
Nice. I envy you. I have an AGM meeting tomorrow, so I'm praying that I die in my sleep. Chris, for the audience, could you maybe tell them a little about yourself, who you are, and what you do?
So I guess how I got known with respect to COVID related stuff is a lot of people assume I'm a lawyer, and I always correct them. I say I'm not a lawyer, and they're like, "You're a paralegal." I'm like, "I'm not a paralegal, but you went to law school." And I'm like, "No, no, 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 no law school, not a lawyer, not a paralegal, never, not a legal professional, never been a legal professional." And to tell you the truth, I haven't wanted to be, not in the climate that we're in. I ended up through there were a number of different things that came up for legal challenges or for asserting one's rights, and it eventually culminated in a court battle with the city of Toronto in 2018, which was heard in January of 2019, and it went to the Court of Appeal in 2020, and I was not successful, but nevertheless I did a very good job. A lot of people thought I did a good job, lawyers and other people in the legal profession, and that's where I got my education. And there's a whole story about that, and I sent it to you. That was covered back in, it was July of 2020, throughout the with the COVID lockdowns and all that. And amidst all that, I my Court of Appeal case was heard and dismissed, and someone took the time to do 6 weeks of research and write a story about it. So it's a great piece, and Off Guardian, which is a great site, in the UK, it's international. They're one of the very few organizations to call out COVID back in March of 2020. So I really respected them for that, and there was nowhere at the time where I wanted to appear more. With respect to what's happened since then, I've taken part in a lot of protests at the time, and then I gave a lot of presentations on knowing one's rights, because very clearly they'd be destroyed by the government. They were not upheld in terms of life, liberty, and property. That's all gone. They were not upholding that. They were destroying life, liberty, and property, doing the exact opposite, ceding their legitimacy to govern, in my view, as I've said. And throughout all this, I wanted to get involved in some legal challenges, and there was nothing happening. I mean, looking back to 2020, nothing doing. No one did anything in Canada. In the United States, there were some legal challenges that were brought up, and even now, there's some of those that are still working their way through the system. But in Canada, nothing until it was December, and and December was when a bunch of Superior Court challenges were brought. It was Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, and BC. And a month before that, this guy, I didn't know who he was. He decided to stand up to the government in Ontario, and this happened in New Jersey as well with a gym there. And they were successful. The government eventually laid off them, but not in Ontario. This guy Adam Skelly decided to just absolutely defy the mandate, defy the lockdown order to close his restaurant, and he kept it open. Granted, most people dined outside, but he kept it open, and they came down on him like 10 tons of bricks, and that's what I got involved in, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to appear on your show. And there are a lot of things that I really agree with you on. There are a lot of things I very much agree with you on. We see eye to eye. We are of the same mind. With respect to Adam Skelly, I mean, he was the only one who stood up. I mean, there was no one else who stood up. There were a handful of other people, but he got all the media. And then the government, they crushed him. They went after him. They hit him with, like 10, they came down on him like 10 tons of bricks, as I like to say. It was 6 separate legal proceedings. They ticketed him, and when the tickets didn't work, then they brought a class order, an order for the medical officer of health. And when that didn't work, then they arrested him for trespassing on his own property, breaking in his own property. They would charging him with mischief and obstruct peace officer in his own property because just wouldn't obey. And they put him in jail for a day and a half, and then they went after him again with an injunction. They got the injunction, and then they sued him for $187,000 worth of damages for calling the police on him. 253 officers on horseback. He was the first trucker. Adam, by more than a year before the convoy, he was the very first person that they used horses on, and a lot of force from these 253 police officers. And a lot of them didn't want to be there. Doesn't matter. They're still coming after him now. He could still be jailed in 2025. And this is all contingent upon his success or failure in his civil proceeding, which is what I'm here to discuss is countering and crushing the great lie in court. The great lie is what we know as the COVID narrative, which, anyone who's listening, you wouldn't be listening if you didn't know. You know what's going on. Okay. And unfortunately, the courts refuse to admit what's going on. And the reason why is because you have to bring the evidence into court with experts. If you don't do that, then, and we'll get into, you have a bunch of questions, but if you don't do that, you don't call out the great lie, then the government will just defer upon itself, right? The judges will just go, well, the government said, right? It's the World Health Organization, the Public Health Agency of Canada, it's the all the medical authorities, all of these public health authorities say that we were really scared and we had to do it. So, and that's at best. That's if they're in any way in some sort of a mood where they want to actually explain anything and not and yeah. And it says here, did RCMP bring horses out to Skelly's? No. In Ontario, the RCMP is strictly federal, and so someone who's out west, the provinces have contracted the RCMP to do local law enforcement. And that was actually, it's bizarre to see. Like, I've been to BC and you see the RCMP, they're right there on the ground. In Ontario, everything is done by local police forces. So in Toronto, it's done by Toronto Police Service. If there's something that comes under Ontario provincial police jurisdiction, which this would absolutely not, then it would be enforced by them. So, and RCMP is nowhere to be found in a local law enforcement matter because that's not what we do here. There's a local police service, there's a provincial police service. So the RCMP would only be engaged in something that was strictly federal matter, in federal, on a federal property. Like it would be something like border related, like the airport or something like that. Otherwise, you're not going to see RCMP in Ontario. So a good question. So I don't know. I've said the background. Adam's case is the only case which calls out the great lie with 6 experts. And the experts are diverse. No one else has done this properly. You would think somewhere, somehow, someone would have done it. In the United States, definitely United States, for sure. Nope, it wasn't done properly in the US. The challenges that are working their way through the courts and the courts of appeal they're interesting, and I think they have a good chance, but they're not based on the calling out the evidence, calling out the great lie, the narrative. The only way to do that is you have to have experts in various different areas. In this case, there's one who's in pharmacology, and he's written on public health policy, and he headed up a unit in the FDA on new drugs. So he's one. There was a former chief medical officer of health in Manitoba refused to re-swear his evidence, so he had to be replaced. Everyone else is intact. Their evidence is from back in 2021 in April, May. The second expert is he's professor of economics at the University of it was Simon Fraser University. His name is Doug Allen. So you might know him because he's written some great papers after becoming involved in this case, and he was definitely known, and he submitted a report in a case that went to the Supreme Court in the United States about 10 years ago. So he's experienced, but never been involved in anything like this with respect to public health. I mean, he's an economist, so he's the economic expert. So you talked about the destruction of the lockdowns on in terms of people's the economic effects, but this translates directly into actual health effects. So that's expert number two. And expert number and the first expert, sorry, I didn't mention. I said pharmacology. So he naturally, someone like that, pharmacology and public health policy, FDA, that's Food and Drugs Administration. Someone like that is going to opine on drugs. In this case, hydroxychloroquine, very, very soundly opines on that. And then there's expert number three. He's it would be sorry, I'm blanking. I don't know why I'm blanking on expert number three. He's Gilbert Burdine. He's an expert in pulmonology, so that's lung related stuff, that's breathing, and he's been a pulmonologist for a couple of decades, and he teaches at Texas Tech University. So he's opined extensively on disorders that can affect the lungs, which could be any infectious disease, and so his report's fantastic. And then there's Dr. Harvey Risch, who is a professor at Yale, or he was, but he until recently, for a long time, and so he's still at Yale as professor emeritus, but he was a teaching professor before that. And then there's also Dr. William Matt Briggs, who taught at Cornell for 20 years, statistics and biostatistics. So statistics obviously figure very prominently in this challenge because the statistics tell you what's really going on the ground without something very objectively, right? And then there's Dr. Byron Bridle, who a lot of people know who he is now, but at the time he was not known outside of his profession. He specializes in virology and immunology and also vaccinology. Adam's case is not a vaccine case. It precedes all that. People stood up for all this stuff back in 2020. There wouldn't be the vaccination mandates, but no one wanted to stand up. So he opines very, in a very passing manner with respect to vaccinations outside the jurisdiction and challenge. It's really about the transmission or asymptomatic transmission, the retransmission of the virus, the aerosolization, and things like that, and the immune response. And there's a lot there that he's opined on really extensively. So I've given you 6 experts' names. The government came back with 1 expert, and that's all they've got. They have a chance to come back with respect to that first expert who was a public health expert. This one is public health policy and pharmacology, things like that. Bridle opines on reasonable alternatives to emergency measures. So does Dr. Gortler, who's that first expert who has replaced the public health expert that the challenge had before. And then there's also Dr. Harvey Risch, Yale epidemiology. He writes extensively mainly on hydroxychloroquine as well. So there's 3 of the 6 experts go into reasonable alternatives. The reason why that's important is because the law says in Ontario, not really in BC, in Ontario, the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act, which is the Emergencies Act for the province, that says, if there's section of 702(2)(b) of that act, it says reasonable alternative. If there's that the emergency measures must be a reasonable alternative to the whatever they have. So whatever they have, if it's some kind of a pharmaceutical or non-pharmaceutical intervention, by definition, if they had it, and they did, it reasonably ought to have known, definitely knew or ought to have known by April, May of 2021 when the reports were published. But then when they were sworn into this challenge, that what the case should have been, that they knew what the reasonable alternatives. And of course, it went on for a whole other year, right? So destroying everyone's lives and livelihood and businesses and everything else and lifestyles and health. And it's horrible, and the effects, of course, are ongoing. So that's absolutely critical. And the reasonable alternatives provision of the EMCPA would necessarily make it so that if any of these things are recognized, whether it's hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, or vitamin D, right? Just vitamin D would have defeated COVID. We know that. There's 77 studies that Dr. Bridle submitted in evidence back in, I don't remember whether it was the first report or the second, but the first was April of 2020. I believe it was the first one in April of 2021. They knew it back then. 77 studies supported the uses of vitamin D, which was very, very widely available to counter COVID, and to really just take a hammer
Sorry,
to
can
the
I jump
mortality
in?
rates. Yes, of course.
I just want to simplify this. The province of Ontario brought in some laws. Your client was saying there were reasonable alternatives, and as per the law, they can't bring that law in if there's reasonable alternatives.
Yeah. So to answer your question, the EMCPA, the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act, every province has some sort of an emergency statute, some sort of emergency act. BC has one. There's a COVID Measures Act as well in BC. In Ontario, we have the Ontario Act, which was brought in July of 2020 to extend the measures of the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act, which can only last for 2 weeks at a time. So what happened with Adam, and I'm not clear. I right at the time I was advisor and coordinator of evidence back in 2021. We've since, with all the supporters of Adam, a not-for-profit corporation called the Concerned Constituents of Canada was created, and so I am one of the co-founders and a director of this not-for-profit corporation. So right now it's like, yes, we're advocating for Adam. This is in the public interest. It must be heard. It is a critical case. There's no other case like it. No other case can be heard. It's too late. But with respect to that act, that act says if there's a reason, if an order is a reasonable alternative to whatever exists at the time, then they can make the emergency order. That was not the case. It was never the case. That no one's ever questioned it. The only time this was ever challenged is in the Quarantine Act, that's federal. In the Spencer Challenge in 2021, this is with respect to the quarantine camps, the quarantine hotels. This is Kian Bexday, if you remember this. They lost. It was the Chief Justice of Federal Court ruled against them. And this is a charter challenge. The Bill of Rights, Canadian Bill of Rights, is brought up, a little bit, but it was really about it was hardly brought up at all. It wasn't really argued properly. That the Canadian, charter was brought up, and he's like, reasonable limits, and that's the most dangerous part of the challenge of that challenge and of the law of what's in the charter itself is section 1, reasonable limits. They can override the whole charter and supreme law of Canada if it's reasonable to do so, and a single judge can do that and override parliament and all that, and it's a really bad thing that we have in there. So, and the Alberta Bill of Rights was amended to include something like that very recently, actually, just a little over a month ago, about 6 weeks ago. So with respect to that, the reasonable alternatives it's in the Quarantine Act. So that's all the border measures, those $6,000 tickets. It's in there. It's in the EMCPA. That's the Provincial Emergency Act for Ontario. And that's really where it is. I don't know in other provinces. I don't want to opine on that. I don't recall right now. But in the United States, in federal law, the Emergency Use Authorization, the EUA, that is what allowed all the testing to be all of a sudden approved at like at warp speed. Okay, the whole operation warp speed. It was the testing which created the cases. Okay, that was made possible by the emergency use authorization. So the cases created the pandemic, right? If you don't have tests and you don't have the media and you don't have masks, you don't have a pandemic. Bottom line. Look at the excess death rates. They spiked in April of 2020. Why? Because caregivers ran out of camps, right? Because they thought they were going to die, and then people died in there. And plus, of course, some of them were given midazolam and things like that. And in Britain, that was obviously the case. In Canada, it was back in the early days in April of 2020. I'm not sure, and we don't know how much they were dispensed of these palliative care agents, which killed a lot of people. But they, of course, they blamed it all on the COVID, everything else, and of course, they were all in a certain age and all of that. So we know that. But we know that these people died because of some care issue or because of pharmaceutical issue or both. In Britain, we know it was pharmaceutical. So, in with respect to anything else with excess death rates, we didn't see that until 2021. So it has nothing to do with COVID. And so it all has to do with testing, test, and the media amplifying it, and then masks, and that's your pandemic. So the emergency measures in the United States, the EUA, is what made the tests legal. I mean, everyone leaned on the U.S. When the tests were legalized under the emergency use authorization, then all of a sudden the tests are fair game, they can be used everywhere. And so that all happened early on. And so when those were legalized, then the remdesivir was all of a sudden legalized on this temporary approval basis on the emergency use authorization, and everything else was authorized, including the vaccinations, which are all experimental. They were all authorized. What does it say in there? It doesn't. I don't recall the exact language. It doesn't say. It says alternative. I don't think it says reasonable alternative. It says alternative. It's essentially the same though as what we have in the EMCPA. That's the Provincial Emergency Act for Ontario, and in the Quarantine Act, it's the Federal Quarantine Act. The orders are made under Section 58. It says the orders can only be made if there's Section 58 1D, if there's a reasonable alternative to emergency measure. If there's no, it's the other way around. If there's no emergency measure, no reasonable alternative to emergency measures, you can't have them. That's essentially what it says. I can read it to you directly, but that's essentially what it says. And so no one, Spencer challenged it, but they didn't challenge it with any experts. That's not going to be successful. And the government had 3 experts. They didn't properly proffer them. They could have. It was a blown opportunity, but nevertheless, that was the only time it was challenged. Never challenged in the U.S. Not challenged anywhere else. Just then, and it was very weak. So Adams' challenge goes up against that and says very clearly 3 of the 6 experts, the emergency measures were enacted. They were imposed when there were reasonable alternatives that the government knew or ought to have known existed at the time, back in April, May of 2021. We'd like to say before that, but and there's certainly a lot of evidence from the pharmacologist. So there's a lot from him saying that they knew back in summer of 2020. And remember, Donald Trump was talking about hydroxychloroquine was March 19th of 2020, and that's the lockdowns came in and goodbye, right? So anyway, that I think I've said enough about that. But the reasonable alternatives argument is absolutely critical, because if you can prove that there are reasonable alternatives that existed back in 2020, 2021, then the whole rationalization for all the public health measures, ending with the vax, goes away. So no one's argued it, and it's too late to argue it now, because you can't sue. It's more than 2 years after it happened. You can't go after the laws that exist back then, because it doesn't exist anymore. So you can only take an existing challenge with the expert evidence is properly proffered. And in this case, back in 2021, 5 of the 6 experts, and the other one wrote everything going back to 2020. So the vast majority is really in 2020 when this is known. It was preceded Adam Skelly's challenge, that they definitely knew. They should have known. They ought to have known. And they decided to engage in a campaign of willful blindness, and that's in the evidence as well. So yeah, I think I'll keep it there with respect to Adam's challenge and why it's so important, because no one else can challenge anything. It doesn't matter. You can have $30 million in the bank. You can't, because you have to do it at the time within 2 years to sue for damages, or while the law is still in force. The laws were repealed back in like March, April of 2022. So it's after that, you can't challenge the law anymore, but you can sue for damages within 2 years. That's long lapsed as well. What about standing? You have to have standing, meaning you have to be affected privately. Well, his business was obliterated, But how many people can come back now and it's too late? And then what about the experts? You don't have the experts. If you get the experts now, oh, hindsight's 2020. The government's not going to be held accountable. They're just going to go, we were afraid, we did what was reasonable, we have immunity, we weren't negligent. That's what they'll get away with today. So the only way to go after them is with expert evidence properly proffered back then. But how can you go back in time? Adam's case is the only one, which is, it's in suspended animation. It was supposed to be heard in June of the end of June of 2021, which was the highest vaccine uptake rate in the history of the world. Was at the end of June of 2021. It was the worst time for him to be heard, and that was kicked. Wasn't permitted to be heard for a variety of reasons. Of senior counsel time blew the case, and he was sued for professional negligence. The settlement was reached, and it allowed this case to go forward. And it is what it is. And it was kicked all the way to October 2024. It didn't happen because remember the public health expert took leave, said not reswearing the evidence. Didn't really give a reason for not reswearing the evidence. And so you can't move forward on a public health case without some sort of a public health basis. This is the closest that existed in this case. So I'm gonna basically leave you there about why this case is so critically important, and just give send go for the case. And if you wanted to call them out, and I know people are reticent about the courts, you'll ask me about that, but the legitimacy of the courts, the reliability, should we trust them or not? Are they corrupt or not? There's a lot to be talked about, but if you don't call out a lie or a liar to their face, and you don't ram the evidence in the law down their throat, they are going to be presumed right. And this is what we have. We have this literally a narcissist, sociopathic environment, an environment of willful blindness where people are not called out. These people are still employed. They're not sanctioned. It says, yeah, moot. So the thing about moot is what I was just saying about Adam. Most cases are moot simply because the law doesn't exist anymore. You cannot challenge a law that doesn't exist anymore. I know, yes, there should be a constitutional amendment and all that. I've been saying it. But as the law stands right now, they can say that something is moot if the law doesn't exist anymore, even if they're prosecuting other people under that same law that doesn't exist anymore. This is what happened with the Quarantine Act. The orders, the last order expired on September 30th, 2022. I think they're still prosecuting people now. A very, 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 very small handful of people, but I think they are, and they were, and I won the Fernando appeal. I told you I'm not a lawyer, but I argued this appeal successfully against the Quarantine Act. The only person who successfully did that in all of Canada. I'm not a lawyer, and I did it right in provincial court. Unfortunately, I want it to be in high court, but you only have jurisdiction in low court because that's where the ticket is. That's where the appeal is heard for a $5,000 conviction. So I won that case outright. The government didn't even bother appealing it. So I know what I'm doing, and I'm the one who was responsible for Adam's experts back in 2021, and yeah, the only way to win this is you can't shut up. And people go, oh, protesting is useless, this and that. Protesting is not useless. Oh, the convoy was just useless. No, it wasn't. The convoy is what ended the tyranny in Canada. The convoy was repeated the world over. The convoy was transplanted to Germany. It was exported to Germany. It was exported to other countries, Netherlands, Germany, the UK in some respects as well. In the UK now, the official opposition is Nigel Farage, which should have never happened because he's an extremist. He's a right-wing extremist. I love Nigel Farage. I've been following him since about 2010 or 2011. He's the official opposition in Britain because things have gotten so bad there because all the people are being arrested for Facebook comments. That's how bad it's gotten. That people have finally put in the official opposition, Nigel Farage. So anyway, I think I've said enough there, tying in politics and everything else that's occurred. Payman, if you want to kind of take the reins of it and ask me something, or go into something that I've mentioned, because all this is highly relevant, and if you don't if you don't stand up and be counted, if you kind of go into the night, don't say anything, try to get along, go along, get along. It's not going to work. People, there's a reason why these tyrannical regimes have hated protesters, even in regimes where they could be killed, like summarily executed. They don't want all these people in the streets, because if enough people get on the streets, it's over for the government overnight. If you have a certain amount of people that overwhelm the police and military, they don't have to do anything violent at all. They just have to show up. It's over. It's you have two to about 2 million people who showed up at the convoy over 3 weeks. You have 4 million people show up in Canada opposing whatever it is. It's over before it even starts. You could stack the police and military on top of each other across Canada. They can't deal with 4 million people who are dissenting. So that's why showing up and being counted counts so much. And voting is part of it. Oh, voting doesn't matter. It's a joke. Well, look what's happened in the US. You may not like Trump. Look what's happened there. Look what's happened in Romania. They're trying to overturn the election results. Look what's happened in Britain, right? With no election even yet with Nigel Farage, when he's head of the official opposition. They want to overturn the election results in the UK. This is key. And the same thing goes for not voting. Whether you vote or not vote, it's good to do both. And the Conservatives are going to get a super majority in Canada anyway. But anyway, that it's there's more here to talk, but probably on another call. There's a lot there. But anyway, please go ahead and take the reins in terms of what you wanted to ask me.
Before we get to the questions,
Yeah.
This can't be how a government, a society is supposed to function, where they can bring laws and then when you're about to sue them, they're just like, oh, we're going to withdraw them. Now it's moot. You go in to sue the government, it's already been 2 years. Meanwhile, somebody stands in the middle of a highway protesting the government, they get charged with terrorism. There's a sense in Canada that our courts have gone just wacko. Like, this is not how they're supposed to function. What are your what's your agreement or disagreement with that?
Well, I actually did a press conference in Ottawa in August about this. We got more views on the Jasper wildfires, which was crazy. But I opined on exactly this. I said in Ottawa, they turned quite literally, parking offenses and noise offenses, like noise, municipal noise ordinance. Okay, making noise and simply parking illegally. They turned those into federal charges, into hardcore federal offenses, and subjected those people to jail. Like Pat King might do 10 years in jail. I don't think so, but he, the threat's there, and it should not be. It should not be possible to charge someone with mischief for something like this. In order to change that, you need to change the law federally to say that mischief should not encompass something like this, or should not encompass a legitimate protest, or certainly if the Emergencies Act was not upheld, the invocation, which is what they used, right? So in EMCPA, the Provincial Emergency Management Civil Emergency Management Civil Protection Act, that was used at the same time as the Emergencies Act. The Emergencies Act was ultimately used to go after these people who, as soon as the truckers started leaving, they started going after them, right? Remember what I said about 2 million people? When there were 1,000 people left, that's when the police moved in. So and they've absolutely destroyed these people, and they're still going after them. And look what's happened in Alberta. These people are in jail. That appeal, I think, will be successful with the Coots 4, with the two who were
Yeah, but their lives are already ruined. They got kept
the
in
punishment is the
remand for so
process.
long.
It's true. The punishment is the process, and so ultimately, the way things work in any country. And this was established in I think it was 1942 with Korematsu in the United States. That's a Japanese internment camp case. It went to the Supreme Court 6-3 against Korematsu, saying you don't have any constitutional rights during a time of war. Remember, it's in the Constitution, right? It doesn't say constitutional rights may be suspended in wartime. It doesn't say that. 6 of the 9 judges of the Supreme Court said yes, they can. Why did they do that? Because the American people were on board with that type of thing. They were on board with internment camps. The Canadian people were on board with lockdowns. They were on board with forcing people to wear masks. They were on and refusing service. They were on board with vaccination, and they were on board with refusing service, like in terms of restaurants, going to a gym, going to a concert, engaging in regular life. People are, as disgusting as it was about Justin Trudeau saying, do we tolerate these people? Do we tolerate these people? Literally, he said that. Um, I'd say the majority of Canadians believe that, or the ones who disagreed kept their mouth shut. The ones who showed up in the streets, not nearly enough people. I mean, the most amount of people who showed up that I saw at a protest this is in this was before, I think it was it May of 2021, or I don't, it was warm out. It was in 2021 before the vaccines. And I think there may be 30,000, 30 or 40,000. And this is in Toronto. Remember, there's like 3 million people in Toronto. So not enough, not nearly enough. There's 14 million people at the time, maybe 15 million people in Ontario now. 30,000 people is not going to cut it. The most amount that showed up before that was maybe 10,000. It's not going to cut it, right? If you have 10% of the population who disagrees, they really disagree in Toronto. There should be at least 100,000 people who showed up, maybe 200,000, 300,000 people, but at least 100,000, and they didn't. And so everyone else advocated for these tyrannical measures. The people who were against kept their mouth shut, and not enough showed up. And that's where the courts will go. The courts will not try to override popular opinion, and they will definitely not try to override the law as it's written by Parliament or the legislature. So if Parliament says that mischief means blocking some property, then technically, if they block something like the roads in Ottawa, they can be arrested for mischief, right? And they don't allow. I don't have it in front of me. I could look it up, but if the law says that, then they can do that. And so the rest of it are the arguments regarding the charter and things like that. And that didn't, the Emergencies Act was not legal in terms of its invocation regarding the charter and respecting the charter. But nevertheless, these prosecutions continue. And so, and look what happened in Alberta. I mean, they concocted a bunch of charges, and they ended up in front of some very bad judges. But there were a really bad prosecutor, and that's it. Like, your prosecutor is paid by you, the taxpayer. If enough people in Alberta said no way, get them out to Coutts 4, Coutts 3, whatever, it would be over. They would stop, but they're not going to, because they want to make an example of them. And the same thing happened with the convoy, right? Not enough people. Yes, enough people showed up to change the government's stance on the mandates, but not enough people showed up to change things with respect to the way the government operated as a whole. The same thing goes for this stuff. And you look what's happening with Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney. They're supporting the repeal of the carbon tax. How did that happen? Right? Mark Carney is Justin Trudeau on steroids. He's actually smart, right? And he's been a huge booster of the carbon tax, and yet all the banks moved against him, right? So now they're saying no carbon tax. So this stuff is going right. Things are going right. I don't think that the powers that be, the Team Satan, as I call them, the Great Reset crowd, I don't think they'll be successful. But the cost could be a tremendous cost. We could lose our country easily, and just the United States alone. Like, we're not even talking about anything necessarily super nefarious. We're just saying that the weakest leaders in the history of this country and the weakest people in the history of this country elected them and kept them elected, and didn't really do anything. And for years, right? It's been going on. So we're weak, and so Trump sees that, and the American people see that, and they're like, why not just take over Canada economically? Like, they don't need to push very hard to take this country over, and it's a bad deal. It's a raw deal. We're not really getting anything in return, and the most we're getting, U.S. dollars, Canadian dollars. What a joke, right? The United States is $35 trillion worth of debt. The average American commits at least 3 felonies a day. The federal government is infinitely larger than our federal government. The kind of powers that they have in what U.S. absolutely bone chilling compared to what, it's a lot of bad things in Canada, but people, they're just unaware. They haven't done their research. They don't know. I've done my research for many years in the US. I like the US in many respects. There are things we can learn from them we should incorporate in Canada. And there's a lot of things in Canada they should incorporate there. But they have this all powerful federal government in the United States, and they're not doing anything to shrink it. Trump has not even suggested shrinking the power of the FBI or anything like that. He's just, well, our guy's in there, so it should be okay. It's not the right thing. Same thing with CIA, same thing with NSA, same thing with EPA, the Department of Agriculture, FDA, whatever. They're these sprawling agencies, and they get all this power. And it took 40 years for the Supreme Court in the United States to overturn something called Chevron deference. 40 years, and one of the judges who's he said when he was in his confirmation hearing, his sole purpose is to overturn this Chevron deference, and he did, and it happened in the summer. It took 40 years. So, and that just allows the government to not get a carte blanche and everything with respect to interpretation of what an agency does. These agencies are given all this power, and then they were given a carte blanche for 40 years, and now finally they're not. But still, the agency's power is there. It's checked a little bit now by the Supreme Court precedent, but it's a really big problem. If we become United States, then we're going to have to follow all of that, and all the Canadian stuff will go away. There's some good things in Canada. There are a lot of good things that, if they're incorporated properly, and we have to do a lot of work to incorporate them. But if they're incorporated properly, we could have a proper, in terms of our rights and freedoms, and we need constitutional amendments and a bunch of other stuff. But anyway, yeah, I went on there a little bit, but yeah.
Well, we're coming on 40 minutes. Let's try to hit a couple of these
Of course,
questions.
of course.
You mentioned how the courts don't like overriding public opinion. Um, how do we change that? Like, is the system, any system's going to fail if it's manned by weak people? Do we just need strong people coming out of law schools?
Yep, that's it. Um, you know, uh, hard times produce strong men, but good times produce weak men. I mean, all that. There's a whole quote on that, but we've all heard it, and that's what we've had. We have an extremely weak society. I mean, I didn't think I was doing anything particularly special when I challenged the city of Toronto, and then later on when I helped Adam find his experts, I didn't think I was doing a lot there, but it turns out I was. I didn't think I was doing a lot with the Fernando appeal, this in the Court of Justice in Ontario, where I won that case, but no one else properly argued that case. Lawyers wouldn't argue it. It's provincial court. It's not worth their time. They're not going to put in the effort that I put in, and they're not going to know that law anyway, because that's not what they do. They specialize. It would be like asking a cardiologist to fix someone's foot. It's not their area. So yeah, with respect to changing how the courts operate, it's really changing. And this is what the woke culture has done. You change the culture first, and then you're able to change the political structure and able to change the economy. So we have to do what they did. We have to go and convince people of, like, win hearts and minds, convince people of what's sustainable and not sustainable, right? What's economically and socially and environmentally sustainable. That's not going to be done by the government. It's going to be done by actual common sense and demonstration that we know how to do it, and we just have to actually practice what we preach. It's going to take work, and we have to change the culture first. That changing the culture, and then changing the political system, changing the law, and then of course the courts are always last, right? The courts will follow. They'll definitely follow the law, but then they'll have to follow the culture too. And so why is all this stuff happening? Because they put all this human rights garbage, like the gender identity stuff, they rammed it down our throats. Jordan Peterson warned everyone in 2016, 2017. In 2017, he went in, I think it was May, with his lawyer, and he testified on it. And he said it's a Marxist construct. They're trying to change the language. And they amended the Canadian Human Rights Act, put in gender identity. What did the provinces do? They followed suit. So the only way we can win this is, of course, over the long term. It can't be done. The way that cultural Marxism works, it's done over time. You take over the institutions, you take over the education, the schooling system, right? You take over that. You take over the government through education. You take over, one representative at a time. And of course everything is compromised, but that happened over time. The only way to seize it back is over time. We may not be able to. It may be too late. But look what they're doing in the U.S. I don't know what'll happen. It remains to be seen. But it's good. I mean, look what's happened in Britain, right? They've had the administrative state for many decades in the UK. It's exceeded the United States and exceeded anything that we have in Canada. That's why people are not really appreciative of what we have in Canada. Everything is provincial, not federal. It's very dangerous when you have a strong federal government like that. That's what our founding fathers advocated for, a strong federal government. They got the opposite. In the United States, you got the strong federal government. In Canada, we got strong provinces. They got weak states. In the US, we got strong provinces. We got crisscross. So yeah, why did that happen? I can't tell you about Confederation. I can't tell you about the Declaration of Independence, or any of that. I can tell you maybe a little bit more about the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War than I can about Confederation in Canada, because we were still under British rule until 1982 officially. So yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done, and people have to, as I said, simply show up and speak up. And if they lock us down again, that shouldn't last for 1 second. It shouldn't even be possible for 1 second. And if it did lock down, it should be for one day, and all of a sudden people come out of the woodwork, and it's totally untenable. But that's why I want the mandates to come back. I've long said it, and people get upset sometimes, and I'm like, no, no, no. I don't need a do-over. We don't need a do-over specifically, but society does, because there are a lot of people who've woken up since then. Society has to be tested again. I don't know when it will happen. It may not happen. It may not happen for some time, but we have to be tested. And if we are, then we could win this pretty quickly. And look what's happened to the carbon tax. Nothing's really happened. And all of a sudden, the carbon tax in Canada is going away. Forget about the US. Like, yes, Trump has had an effect on all these countries, including this country, but the carbon tax suddenly just going away like that, and literally two liberal like front runners saying that they're going to repeal the carbon tax. That's unbelievable. Like, I didn't see that coming. I thought they would still try to ram it down our throats. And remember, all the court decisions are being 100% for the government. It doesn't matter, because they made the law. They said they can regulate greenhouse gases, and all the courts except the Alberta Court of Appeal agreed. And then the Supreme Court agreed, because they didn't challenge the evidence. No one bothered. Remember what I said about Adam Skelly? No one challenged. And I know, Payment, I've seen some of your guests. I saw your last guy, at least the last one I saw on a Rumble channel. He was talking about, climate change. I mean, we know this. This is not, I don't think it's a rumor. At this point, it's not a rumor anymore. We know what drives the climate. There's a lot. What drives the climate? The guy said, it's the sun. I'm saying it's the sun, and then the clouds. The sun and the clouds. Is that anything that's particularly controversial? And yet the government of Ontario didn't bother bringing that evidence. They disqualified themselves about a minute and a half into their opening arguments by saying we're not challenging anything to do with global warming or climate change. Well, then you lose. Then you're taking on some legal arguments that have no chance. So when people wake up with respect to vaccination and with respect to climate change and all that, then that's it. Like, there's nothing much more left in terms of the great lie. But as long as that happens, as long as it doesn't happen, really, then status quo will continue. But when people challenge this stuff, with the carbon tax, I guess the only reason why they're challenging it is because the prices of things have gone so high that we can't afford it, literally can't afford it anymore, and there could be an economic collapse. Now, with the 25% tariffs looming, if they're imposed in just a few days, I mean, this country could collapse very quickly by way of a dollar collapse. So it says, if you were surprised by Freeland, Carney disavowing the carbon tax, they're copying Kamala's campaign. Marxists while in power, conservative are running. Yeah, I agree overall with that. I've never voted for a mainstream political party, not liberal, conservative, NDP, Green, None of them. I never would. I voted libertarian, and then when the PPC came into existence, as I said, I was campaign manager, the first one in Oshawa, which is outside of Toronto. So we got the third most amount of votes in Ontario. So that was interesting. I wouldn't do it again, but it was interesting. And I voted for PPC. Of course, I voted in that election where we ran the candidate, and then in the next election, of course, I voted for PPC. And I've said, vote for PPC or sit on your hands. And otherwise, provincially, it doesn't look good in Ontario. But I know, really speaking to a BC crowd. So and it says here, I'm just looking here, so many the moot stuff and dismissing all these. You can't get any case law in the books. That's another thing. There's one guy who was arrested, charged. He was arrested twice, charged twice with something called common nuisance back in 2021 for protesting, for simply arranging protests in Niagara region near Niagara Falls. And he was, he on one of the charges, the exact same charge. The first charge in the first trial, he was acquitted. Second trial, he was convicted. He went to appeal. I wrote his written stuff in the just in the week before the appeal was heard. He won, but there's no precedent that was set. That was done very deliberately. Yeah, so it is very damning and that was, I absolutely do not, I approve, of course, of the decision to allow his appeal, but I absolutely do not agree with the decision itself, with the reasons, the endorsement, which is not being made public. It's a garbage decision, so it is what it is. And then it says something about public health sectors being acting in bad faith. Absolutely, it's all bad faith. And then Carney not calling election. You will not. So just to put this kind of to bed, we won't show up on March 24th with Parliament won't reconvene, and then you'll have Carney as dictator of Canada. I know people think that'll happen. I hope people keep thinking that'll happen. That's the only way it won't. But yeah, there will be an election called. It will happen because Jagmeet gets his pension, because it's we're well past that time of March 24th. So he'll get his pension. Everyone's going to get their pension. So there's no reason to stand behind the government. The government is destroyed anyway. Trudeau is the absolute ultimate of all lame ducks in all political history of the Western world. So yes, and that's about Carney there, and then about Pat King and the process of the punishment, Coots trials. Carney, of course, I agree with everything about Carney. I've known about Carney for a long time. I've known about Carney because I have a financial background. I know I went into the legal stuff, and I don't have any legal training. I mentioned that, but financially, like, that's where I am, and I'm in finance, and yeah, I've known Mark Carney because he was head of the Bank of Canada. He was head of the Bank of England. I know exactly who he is well before the WEF. The WEF never really came up. So I know who he is, and so then yes, Trump sounds like he's expanding. He wants to expand government, and everyone wants to expand government. The way that our legal system has worked everywhere, it's not necessarily British common law, but in general, it's additive. It's not subtractive. So when there's a bad law made, they generally will keep it, and they'll make another law to kind of maybe amend that law a little bit, but keep a lot of it in, or they'll make some other law to kind of supersede it, something like that. But they will not repeal that law. They won't just take a hacksaw to the laws that are problematic. That's all they need to do. And yeah, and people say about the charter, I'm pretty good with the charter. The problem is Section 1. But overall, I'm pretty good with the charter. I've been very successful with the charter, and I've been behind the scenes in a lot of cases where I wrote the charter challenges, where I ghost wrote various challenges, and I was very successful with the charter. But it wasn't good with respect to COVID. That's where, because of reasonable limits, because of what is reasonable and what the court can opine on and cannot opine on. If a bunch of public health goons are with doctors, and doctor names or degrees are after them, and I'm an expert and you're not, and the courts are going to say, well, we're not. So yeah, it's not it's not that the charter says that is a huge problem. The Alberta Bill of Rights was amended to put that garbage provision in there. It allows a single judge to override it, so it shouldn't be there. And then stuff about carbon tax, the sun and plants both have an effect on the earth. Okay, but remember, there's global warming going on and climate change going on Jupiter and planets like that. And that's when I started getting wise to this stuff some time ago. And then when 2009 came out with ClimateGate, it was very obvious that they were using the same stuff they used to go after cholesterol, right? To sell statin drugs and to demonize saturated fat, and then they used that with iodine decades before that to remove that from our food supply. With the main side effect of which, from a deficit of iodine is mental retardation. So it's being removed from our food supply, folks. You should take it. And then look at what happened with COVID, right? We're the experts, and there's been a lot of medical, not necessarily frauds, but stuff where people believe something and some really dumb stuff was done, very harmful stuff was done. Like the orbital frontal lobotomy was in vogue for some time, but done by Dr. Walter Freeman, who was not a doctor, right? So these experts have run afoul, not necessarily, yes, with big pharma now, with this huge monetary incentive, but back then they really believed they were right. They were really intellectually arrogant, and they really believed they were right. And the kind of stuff they were doing to people, they were destroying people's lives. Rosemary Kennedy, right? There was RFK Jr.'s aunt. She was lobotomized, right? That's one of the things that ended Walter Freeman eventually, but it took some time. Countless lives were ruined. So this scientific, chicanery, this what is now fraud. It is outright fraud or willful blindness, gross negligence. No question. But yeah. So it says about election and super spreaders and all that. So yeah, that's the statin hoax. Yeah, believe me, I've been all over that for over 20 years. I've been all over that. And then red dye number 3. There's so many problems. There's a book called the 100-Year Lie. This book you can find it, but it was blacklisted for a while. It was written, I think, in 2007. And I would definitely recommend reading it because it talks all about the 10,000 chemicals we're exposed to, and 40,000 that
So
have been invented. Yeah.
super spreaders. He makes these short educational videos, and he said he's made one about Rose Kennedy.
Well, we're definitely statin hoax and then Rose Kennedy. I've kind of hit the jackpot there. I've mentioned a bunch of stuff and kind of hit really, really square on a couple of them. So
Seems
yeah,
like he found a kindred spirit in you.
absolutely.
Oh, this is funny. One more godless woman. I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy.
Yeah.
Well, I guess time flies, but Chris, let's end it on a positive note. I've had a horrible week. That's why I was so angry with the courts. But like, what's some positive things that are coming towards Canada?
Well, I can. Okay, so the most positive thing I can tell you is that who am not a lawyer, I won one case where I outright was allowed to represent Milani Fernando, who was ticketed, got $6,255 tickets, and then she's convicted. It was 5,000 that was owing, and she appealed it. And I wrote the appeal and appeared for her. I was allowed to, and I won it outright. And I'm mentioning the decision, and I can give you the link for that later on Canly, and you can post it. That is very positive because no one in Canada was successful. A lot of people argued that, but didn't argue it with enough law, and lawyers didn't want to argue it. It wasn't worth their time with the amount that they'd have to put into the case, and the amount that it was $5,000 ticket, so they'd have to do like literally $20,000+ worth of work. So they're not going to do that. The math is upside down. So I won that, and remember, I'm not a lawyer, and I did it, and it's politically charged, it's COVID related. But I got a good judge, and his judge stuck his neck out very early on in 2021. So I got the right judge. But I argued it correctly, and I won that. And then there was Colin McDonald's case, he was charged criminally. I mentioned this for protesting for common nuisance. I wrote his reply submissions literally in the week before the trial, or not the trial, the appeal hearing. And and the court was packed to the gills, standing room only. And I said, like, I don't know what's going to happen today, but Colin, the way that I prepared him, he won't need to say a word. Now, I wasn't allowed to say anything in court. With the judge just, you dismissed me. He's like, go back behind the bar. And I thought, like, whatever happens, like, we're going to have something really good in front of the Court of Appeal after this. Then whatever, it is what it is. I'm fine. What did the judge do? The judge didn't let me talk. He said, Mr. McDonald, you don't need to say anything. I have your written submissions. He handed Cullen the victory right then and there, which never happens. Not in appeal court, not in superior court, but it's not just an appeal hearing; it's a double appeal. So I fully expected to go in there, and we'll see what happens. But I don't expect a decision to be rendered today. I mean, it takes a few weeks, right? It's two appeals. You got to weigh all of the arguments and everything else. That's what you do on appeal. He gave Cullen the victory right then and there. The whole courtroom erupted like in a movie, like more than in a movie. Like, it was crazy. And then a decision was written, 32 paragraphs. 2 hours later, and Colin was like, I have the decision. I'm like, no, you don't. No, I have the decision. I have the endorsement. I'm like, no, you don't. No, you don't. No, I have it right here. And I'm like, that's impossible, because it will take the judge a few weeks to cover himself with his decision. Guess what? The judge did write the decision. And he probably wrote it beforehand. He had to have written it before. You can't come up with 32 paragraphs in 2 hours. It's impossible. So yeah, and that's not legal, but it is what it is. And that decision is not public. Okay, so but the bottom line is here is that through my submissions, Colin wrote his submissions, and he had help. I slammed the door shut on everything the prosecution said in their appeal. I slammed the door shut. And I put a book of authorities, 29 authorities, 1,300 pages. I put the reply factum in front of them, very easy to understand. And the judge bent the knee because of a full courtroom, and because I stuck my neck out, was willing to represent him, wasn't allowed to, but my submissions were all counted, and he won that. And that was supposed to criminalize protests in Ontario. That was done very deliberately. That was super strategic, and it failed. And what else failed? Then in New Brunswick back in 2020, in June of 2020, the vaccine mandate by the legislature failed by 2 votes. Remember, this was during COVID. How did it fail? I said it at the time, I couldn't believe it. So that was supposed to pass. That was supposed to be rammed through, and all the provinces were supposed to pass legislation like that. It didn't happen. So yeah, that's what is to be looked forward to. The dominoes are falling. The courts always go last. They turn, but they turn last. Well, ultimately, the political culture has to change. This will change with a conservative government, which will do things that we do not like and that people who vote for them do not like. Just like what happened in Britain. It will happen. And then eventually we'll get some government which really advocates for subtraction of law. That is the deconstruction, the destruction or deconstruction, however you want to. Frankly, a lot of legislation does need to be destroyed. That's how it should be. We should just absolutely raise the stuff, chainsaw, blowtorch, carpet bomb these not precedents, that the precedents flow from the laws it's written by Parliament or legislature. So they can simply convene and just get rid of this garbage. They can do it. We can do that. This is what Bruce Party, I'm sure people who know Bruce Party, is a professor at Queen's. I met him in 2016. Okay, he said if we can just change the law, right? We can change the law in Ontario. We can change the law federally, right? Once the government changes, we can change the law. We should absolutely take no prisoners in terms of changing the law, and that's the way. The only person I've heard talking remotely like that is Max Bernier, but he should go out there and say, we're going to repeal this, we're going to repeal that, we're going to repeal that. Guess who said that? The only person. It was Javier Milei in Argentina. He said that. He said, we're gonna throw this in the garbage. We're gonna throw this in
He
the garbage.
literally took a chainsaw.
You saw it, the chainsaw, but he was throwing all these department names. Of course, they're all in Spanish. He's throwing them in a garbage, right? Sort of like in that movie in what was it called? uh, uh, I can't remember the name of the movie right now. The Big Short, The Big Short. In that, you see Ryan Gosling start throwing all this stuff in the garbage, all the financial instruments in the garbage, and that's what Malay did. And we got to see that in Canada. Provincially more than federally, federally a bit, but provincially that's where all the abuse is. And in the United States, all abuse is federal. So that's what they need to do. And until I hear that, the dominoes are falling with respect to where we are today. But if we just become aware, if society becomes aware that the vaccines are causing a tremendous amount of harm, more than any other medical products in the history of humanity. Um, if that's ever recognized, if it comes to the fore, I think it will. Just like every other medical thing has come to the fore eventually, but something like that comes to the fore, it's recognized. That could be enough to change the government forever and to really chop down the size of government. And government has to collapse anyway. This shouldn't sound depressing or alarming. Government's too large, right? Government's grown exponentially since 1978 in Canada, or 1981 or 82 in the United States. So it's something to be discussed on a future interview, but this is positive that this cannot continue, and they want to create this 1984 type of surveillance state, or that with Brave New World, where really in the West it's Brave New World with all the drugs that you want, and of course the vodka or the gin. Sorry, it was gin from Winston drank so much as he was crying these clove-soaked tears from all the gin he was drinking, which infused with fake clove, and at the end of 1984. So it's about doing all that. But if people say no, no, because you've gone way too far and you threaten my life, you threaten my family's life, and it's over. That's all we really need. And yes, it's not the provinces, it's the people. The people have to demand it and take no for an take absolutely refuse to take no for an answer. That we just have to demand it. And so yeah, and talk about cosmetics and the red dye and all that. There's a lot of problems. There's a lot. My favorite movie. I should end. You know what? This is a good thing to end with. I should end with, yeah, a movie recommendation and a quote, which I'll find for you very quickly. But the movie recommendation is a movie came out in near the end of 2020, 2019. So before 2020. It's called uh, Dark Waters, and it's a true story, totally true story. And Mark Ruffalo I believe, is a self-avowed Marxist. He's the main character. Great movie. This movie was blacklisted. Okay, I love blacklisted movies. This is it's a true story where a lone lawyer decided to sue DuPont for one client. DuPont is in West Virginia, which they own West Virginia. So he decided to sue them. It took 17 years, and he won. I don't think I'm giving up too much here. It is extremely positive. This is what they fear. So this is 2019. We're in the right direction here. This stuff with the Great Reset and everything to do with vaccination came up, but the shakeout is happening and things are moving in the right direction. The dominoes are falling. I just wanted to read you this one quote, where oh yeah, no, I remember where I have it. I have it in my saved messages, and uh, oh, where is it? Sorry, I will find it. It's Douglas. Okay, so I'm going to end with this quote because this was said in 1858 by a he was a former slave. He was a black in 1858. Not easy in the United States, right? And he came up with this in his speech. It's one of my favorite of all time. It applies to everyone today, everyone who's oppressed, everyone with respect to COVID, everyone who is lied to, everyone who's woken up, and even who hasn't woken up yet. It says, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." So remember what I said earlier. People kept their mouth shut. What does it say here? Quietly submit to. What did we have? Quiet submission until one day stuff bubbled up. We got the convoy in the worst climates, like the coldest anything outside of Scandinavia, in the worst time of the year, when all these people showed up and got frostbite. And the only reason why I didn't go is because my mom fractured her pelvis, like literally like 2 days before I was supposed to go. So, but everyone else who I know went, and almost everyone got frostbite. But that made all the difference because you people were not quiet anymore. Quiet and good, well mannered. No, not with tyranny. Thank you very much for having me.
Um, uh, Super spreaders, thanks for tuning in.
Yeah.
Chris, I wanted to thank you very much for coming on. I will get you back on. I know you have another court case you want to talk about, and then another one generally. I think we should have like a political discussion. But thank you for sharing your Friday with us.
Yes, and I would still say like Adam Skelly's cases, we're on a knife's edge again. There's more money that has to be raised because the government has done everything possible to get this case dismissed. So Payman will put up the Give Send Go page, and I do have to update it with the latest expert because that latest expert is not being subbed in for the earlier expert who refused to re-swear his evidence.
Can you just do a plug for that? Like what is it under? The Give Send
Oh,
Go?
yeah, I will. Let me just, if I type this in and then put in just type it in. If I can type it in, I don't know, I'm going to try to. I just copied it. Join the chat. Hold on. It says connect the YouTube. Okay. I'm not
No, just
sure.
tell it to me. I'll
I
share
can
the
put it.
screen. It's Alex. What?
Okay. I put it in private chat. So it's givesendgo.com/bbq_rebellion.
Got it. Got it.
givesendgo.com/bbq_rebellion. That's Give Send Go, but there's also there's like an e-transfer address. And I'm going to type this in as well. At this e-transfer address is for people who don't want to go through the Give Send Go. Some people don't want to. They want to do a direct transfer. Either way, we're a not-for-profit. This stuff is accountable. We have to do annual general meeting, and all the accounting stuff has to be done, has to add up. So the BBQ Rebellion is the Give Send Go BBQ_rebellion after /givesendgo.com, and then there's CCOC for freedom at protonmail.com. This is the general email address if you want to write back and mention anything that I said tonight, or you want to do an e-transfer. This is CCOC, the number 4, freedom at protonmail.com. So this is here. Take a look at it and copy it down, or anything would really help in this case, because the government has done everything possible in terms of getting security for cost orders, all sorts of stuff that was not handled correctly in 2021 by council at the time. That's why the negligence lawsuit it was brought and the settlement was reached. But this is what happens, unfortunately, and you can't control every situation. And if council decides to not follow your instructions, even though that you give them 4 times over, there's nothing you can really do about that. And your case then takes a hit, and then you don't even know when it will be heard. And then what about your public health expert doesn't want to re-swear his evidence? Then you can't be heard. So this is a real problem, but it is what it is, and the evidence stands and must be heard.
Well, Chris, again, thank you very much for coming on. Everyone else, if you can go to Give Send Go, and anything you can give would be much appreciated.
Would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
All right, Chris, have a great weekend and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you again.